Hi, Gabor. Great to see you. How you doing?
I'm very well, thanks very much.
Listen, welcome back to the AD4E Festival, but this time with your brand new, very shiny, beautiful book. Massive congratulations on publication week.
Thank you so much.
It's a beautiful thing. Now it's called, as we know, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness and Healing in a Toxic Culture. How do you feel to have it out there? It's been born, so to speak.
This book took me 10 years to research and 2.5 years to write. And at times I really had lost heart. I just thought I wasn't up for it. In fact, at one point, I actually gave the money back to the publisher saying, I can't do this. And then even after I revived it, I had lots of doubts because it's such a big topic. And I'm really talking about how the entire culture creates so much distress for people, so that what is normal in this society is actually completely abnormal from the point of view of human needs and human health. And I'm looking at medicine, I'm looking at physiological illnesses, I'm looking at what they call mental illness, I'm looking at childhood development, birth, pregnancy, politics, culture, like how we raise children, the work conditions that people have. So it's just all a massive, it's really bringing together everything I've ever learned as a physician and as a human being. So I feel very excited to finally have it done and very relieved to be at this stage.
I'm glad to hear it. And I heard you talk about that in an interview, your worries and concerns, and that you had a lot of doubt that you perhaps hadn't experienced in previous books. You worried that it was too big a topic, as you've just said. So it's great that you've got it to a point that you're happy with it, presumably, and it's out there and ready to go, an incredible achievement. So, I mean, does that mean that it is significantly more of an achievement for you personally than your other books?
That's like asking a parent which is his favorite child. But this took a lot more work. This is a lot harder. It really challenged me because the other books dealt with more specific topics, like the addiction or what they call ADHD or physical health and stress. This is a combination of everything, you know, much broader. So this is by far the toughest.
Yeah, you say in your acknowledgements that, like most books, it didn't spring forth like Athena from the head of Zeus, yeah. which I thought was a great metaphor. So, I mean, you've said like 2.5 years writing, but 10 years researching. It's a long time, isn't it? It's a long time. Do you remember the moment where you decided that whatever it was that was going on up there in your head was going to enter the world as a book, and in particular as this book? Do you remember a moment?
What happened was that I've been collecting material now for 10 years, and I've collected, believe it, I collected and filed 25,000 different articles, newspaper reports, scientific papers, medical journal articles, 25,000 of them, and a couple hundred books, and 300 interviews. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at some point I just gave up and I said, I can't do this, it's too big. And then all of a sudden I was sitting there having breakfast in San Francisco with my wife at a hotel, and all of a sudden it just came back, and the title, The Myth of Normal. So it was like almost like a sudden epiphany that I was going to do this. And from then on, it happened. And that was 4 years ago now.
That sounds like a good breakfast epiphany to me. So
I wish I could have one every morning, you know?
Yeah, don't we all? Absolutely. Well, I'm glad whatever was in that breakfast, yeah, we've got that to thank perhaps. But no, I'm glad it came back and you had that epiphany, and that it's out there. So obviously this question is one that you're going to be asked a lot. Well, you've probably already been asked it, so I'll go for it anyway, even though it's not an original question. It's a very important question.
Yeah.
Why is normal a myth, and why does it matter?
Yeah, well, so we tend to assume that what is normal is also healthy and natural. So you say, oh, that's normal, you know. Now, there's some truth to that, in that in medical terms, the body can only exist within a normal range of physiological conditions. I mean, below or beyond a certain temperature, or a certain level of acidity of the blood, or a certain level of blood chemicals, or blood pressure, there's a normal range outside of which there's health or death, or there's disease or death, you know. So in that sense, normal is a useful phrase. But we tend to apply that to our usual experience. And so we think our usual experience is normal. But if you look at people's usual experience in this particular culture and compare it to how human beings evolved over millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years, and how children were raised, how people related to each other, our society is completely abnormal compared to the evolutionary determined human experience, so that what is considered normal in society is totally abnormal. So that's the first point. The second point is there's this belief that there's normal people, then there's abnormal people, and abnormal people are the ones that we label with disease. But what I'm saying is that what we call illness in this society, and this is true for both a lot of physical illness and certainly for a lot of what we call mental illness, is that these are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. So to call people abnormal is to ignore the fact that, in fact, their experience and their responses are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. So the abnormality is not in the individual, but it's in the environment and the culture that these people are responding to.
Okay, so this abnormality that you're talking about kind of translates then to your next term, which is toxic culture.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about that.
Sure. So it's very simple, really. Like in a laboratory, if you're growing microorganisms in a petri dish, you'd call that a culture medium. That's what we call it. We talk about culturing microorganisms. Now, if a lot of the microorganisms in that petri dish start to die off or to show pathology, we'd call that a toxic culture. Now, for God's sake, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday of a teenager being on 10 psychiatric drugs. 10 psychiatric drugs. 10. And this is an increasing phenomenon, is that the increasing rate of anxiety diagnosed among young people, ADHD, depression, suicide rates are going up amongst the youth. Well, if our culture was then, is that petri dish in which people are growing, that this is a toxic culture. You know, in the United States, which is the richest country in the history of the world, 70% of adults are at least on one medication. 70%. That's a toxic culture.
Yeah, I don't know what is a toxic culture if that isn't, you know, an indication of it. Okay, so you talk in your book about also about a toxic culture being one where basic human needs are not being met at all, and that this in turn leads to all kinds of adaptations, which kind of do serve a purpose for a while, but then that leads to distress, both physical and emotional.
Yeah. So the thing about adaptations is that human beings are very adaptable creatures, but we don't do our best in every environment. We can adapt to environments, but it doesn't make them healthy for us. So to give an obvious analogy from my book, when I was writing the book in January or February 2021, there was a big ice storm, a freeze in Texas. I mean, the electrical grid was destroyed and people were cold, freezing in their homes. People adapt by putting on warm clothing, lying under blankets, and so on. That's a necessary adaptation. But if they were still wearing that clothing, that warm clothing, and those blankets in the summer heat in Texas, they would die of hyperthermia. So an adaptation in one setting can become a threat to health and to life in another setting. Now, in a culture that doesn't understand, in fact, tramples on children's development, children, the young human being, will make adaptations that help them survive the immediate circumstance, but those same adaptations become problems later on. So one example is the diagnosis that I was given, which is of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, the essence of that is tuning out, absent-mindedness. Now, they say you got this disease. It's not a disease. What happened was that when I was an infant, and you probably know the story as a Jewish infant living under the Nazis for the first year of my life, there was a lot of stress and threat to life in my existence. How does an infant deal with it? You can't escape it. You can't fight back. The infant's mind just tunes out as a way of surviving. But that tuning out then gets programmed into the brain, and later on it becomes a problem. And so a lot of what was considered pathology in this society begin as adaptations to abnormal circumstances. And I'm saying that whether we're talking about physical disease, chronic physical illness, or we're talking about what they call mental illness, a lot of them have to do with adaptations in the beginning.
Okay, that's really clear. So you're basically linking distress, illness, disease in all its forms with a culture that is, I guess, disconnected, and where people are adapting all kinds of ways to survive. And then those adaptations, coping strategies, are often pathologized and called illness or disease.
Yeah, no, of course, the problem for the individual is those same adaptations that serve the function at one point do create problems later on. But then what the medical profession does, it pathologizes them and say they got this disease, rather than looking at the original function of the adaptation and how can it help the individual grow past that adaptation and let go of it. Instead of that, make a disease out of it.
Well, Gabor, there's absolutely no doubt that your whole book, and you've explained that it's about all aspects of culture and society. It's entirely relevant to what we're talking about at today's festival. But there is a chapter in the book called An Inaccurate Map of Our Pain, What We Get Wrong About Mental Illness, which obviously speaks very directly to what we're focused on here. You start this chapter with the story of a guy called Daryl Hammond, who's a famous American TV personality. And I found this particularly emotional. You know, I know it will resonate, his story will resonate with many people who are watching today. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, so Daryl Hammond is a very well-known American television figure. He was a comedian. He was on Saturday Night Live for a long time. You know, he's a wonderful mimic and comedian. And he first began to experience mental distress in college years, and he was diagnosed with all manner of psychiatric labels and given one medication after another. And he saw about 30 or 40 psychiatrists over a couple of decades, and they all labeled him with one thing or another and medicated him until he finally saw a psychiatrist in New York who said, I don't want to call what you have as a disease. Trouble is you were traumatized. And so it turns out, and nobody had ever asked Daryl this, but in childhood he was really terribly traumatized in his family of origin. And all his symptoms could be related to that history of abuse. And it took decades, and again, dozens of psychiatrists, till one of them finally said, you don't have a mental illness, you have a history of trauma. And that made a huge, not that immediately liberated Daryl from his patterns and from his distress, but all of a sudden, it was a big aha. It was like he says it was like a hallelujah moment, he said.
Yeah, that was particularly powerful, that phrase, a hallelujah chorus moment. It kind of, made me take a bit of a sharp intake of breath, because it was like revelation for him. And I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it, that somebody can be involved in services for so long, for decades, without being asked that very simple question about what's happened.
What happened? The same is true, by the way, of physical illness. I give many examples of people with autoimmune disease, for example. which documentably is linked to childhood trauma in many cases. And the physiology of it is very, very clear of how trauma leads to inflammation and so on. But all these cases of people with severe autoimmune illness, nobody ever asked them what happened to you. It's all about the symptoms and the labels. So that phrase, inadequate map to pain, actually owed to our mutual friend Johan Hari, because I interviewed Johan for this book. We tend to interview each other for our books. So he's interviewed me a few times. I've interviewed him, and he was talking about his own experience of mental distress, and he said that these diagnoses or those psychiatric labels are an inadequate map to our pain. I thought it was a beautiful phrase, so I made that the chapter heading. But
Yeah.
that phrase applies across the board to certainly mental health diagnoses and a lot of physical diagnoses as well.
I wondered about sharing some quotes that really resonated for me. Is that okay? I mean, to be transparent, I've chosen these quotes mainly because they so clearly support the central message of this festival, and that feels important because, as I've discussed with you before, I think that many of us find ourselves really quite isolated, unsupported in the challenge to the medical model in many different contexts. And I thought, well, if I find them validating and affirming, I can imagine that others here would do too. So the first one, and thank you for going along with this, the first one is, and I quote, "The term mental illness implies a physiological dysfunction of the brain as a source of the sufferer's symptoms, just like angina pain connotes a restriction of oxygen supply to the heart muscles." I wondered if you could expand on that and why that's problematic.
Well, it's problematic because in the case of anginal pain, we can do various studies, like an angiogram, for example, that outlines the caliber of the blood vessels, and you can see the blockage. So the physiology is there to be seen, to be identified. Not only is it there to be identified, it's also there to be corrected, need be. So cardiac surgeons can go in there, or cardiologists can go in and open up the narrowed airways or replace them. But there's no such correlate when it comes to what we call mental illness. There's no physiology that you can demonstrate on a scan or on a biopsy or on an angiogram or any modality, so that the speculation about the physiological dysfunction of the brain is purely that. It's speculation, but it's not demonstrable. And there's no signs that when you see this sign on this particular examination, that explains the symptoms or the disease itself. So that's what makes it problematic. The second one, problematic issue, is that the medications that we give, which by the way sometimes can be helpful, and as I can tell you personally, they're not specific. We don't really know why they work. So there's much less. And I think it was you or Lucy who said to me once, so just because you take an antidepressant and it works, an SSRI and it works, and you can't make the assumption that therefore this condition was caused by lack of serotonin any more than if you went to a party and if you were socially shy and you had a whiskey, that you could say that your social anxiety was caused by a shortage of whiskey in your brain, so that we just don't have the same ways to measure either results or causes as we do in what they call physical illness. Having said that, I'm not totally prepared to rule out. I think you guys are. I'm not quite on the same page as you are there, that there's nothing going on in the brain physiologically, just because we haven't been able to show that it's there. I mean, the brain is the physical organ, like every other physical organ in the body, like the heart or the guts and so on. Why couldn't it have physiological disturbances like every other organ in the body? Why can't it? Theoretically, why couldn't it? Number one. Number two, just like the heart responds to life experience, so that the biology of the heart is not just given by genetics, it's very much given by what life experiences a person has had. Same with the brain. So when somebody's had really tough traumatic experiences, why couldn't that have an impact on the biology of the brain? That doesn't mean that the so-called disease or the distress originates in the brain.
Yeah, I think we go along with that. I mean, we can see the results of trauma on brain scans. It's just that it's not there before the trauma or before the adversity.
It's not that. Yeah, that's the part that the psychiatrists seem to miss, is that they do these scans, for example, on drug addicts, and they see certain changes as a result of the addiction. What did the brain look like before the addiction? What caused those changes? You know, what life experiences. You can also see the effect of poverty on brains. You know,
and stress as well. You know.
Yeah.
So
I think brain function is involved, but we're near we don't have the capacity to reasonably measure it. There's a way to predict what that person's going to experience.
I think some people get really confused about the arguments that we sometimes put forward, that we do put forward, and get confused about the whole thing around biology, because we're all biological creatures. That's what we are. And the argument is about causation, isn't it? And that these disorders, so-called, they're not organic kind of biological illnesses. They're results
of life experience. Yeah,
exactly.
Of course. And that's okay. I quote a very well-known neuroscientist, Dr. Jaak Panksepp, who was poured this vein on this idea that depression is this biological imbalance. He says everything has to do with biology, like even death has a biological imbalance, you know, so that, but what causes the imbalances is life experience. By the way, that's also true of heart disease, you know. I mean, there's rare instances of heart disease that are genetically determined, but by and large, the heart reflects a person's life, including stress, including smoking. And why do people smoke? It's because they're stressed, you know, so that it's not that different. The whole body, the biology of the body and the brain is very much under the impact of life experience.
One of the other points you made after that quote that I read out was about agency, and somehow this presentation of mental illness as a disease kind of limits or takes away even agency and control, and perhaps leading to hopelessness and despair.
Well, Daryl Hammond pointed out that until he understood the correlation between his childhood trauma and his adult mental state, he completely lacked power. He says, in the story, I was the only one without any power. People that abused me as a child had power. The doctors had power because they could make all these diagnoses and prescribe all these medications and define my experience, but I had no agency. People recover their stories and they understand the relationship between their history and their distress. They have no agency. Now, once you understand those correlations, and first of all, once you understand that what trauma does is it imposes a certain set of beliefs in the individual. For example, I'm not lovable, or I'm a defective human being, or whatever a person believes. Once you realize that those beliefs have nothing to do with reality, but they're resourced in a certain kind of experience, it also means you can begin to drop those beliefs. And when you can begin to choose the meaning, when you get to define the meaning of your experience, all of a sudden you have agency.
Yeah, it's an important point to make, I think. And like so often when diagnosis is taken as or presented as an explanation for distress, then real explanations are kind of out the window, aren't they? It's like people stop looking for other explanations because they've got an explanation. And in that process, stories are negated and dismissed and all of that.
Well, it was either you or Lucy that pointed out to me the circular absurdity of diagnosis. So Gabor has ADD. How do we know? Because he tunes out. Why does he tune out? Because ADD. How do we know he's got ADD? Because he tunes out. Why does he tune out? And you know, the diagnosis. This is really important. The diagnoses don't explain anything. Now they can describe things, and sometimes they describe them quite accurately. But a description is not an explanation.
Yeah, that's Lucy that talks about that kind of circular thing that goes round and round and round. And I like your analogy with the poo and piglet thing in the book. That was spot on. Another quote, you say psychiatry, along with other medical specialities, takes complex processes intricately bound with life experiences and emotional development and slaps a label on them and calls it a day. And I wanted to share that quote because it's so true, isn't it? Like the energy of that quote, it kind of, to me, suggests that it's done routinely without much care. And I think in this system that you describe, in this toxic culture, that is sadly largely true. So I wanted to share that. Okay, Gabor, you're really clear that you don't believe that mental illness is a biological disease or condition as such, but how do you think that we overcome the massive problem that it's still very much presented as a biological disease or condition by people with a lot of power, and then that this leads to iatrogenic harm, like harm in the name of treatment, that can and does, in the case of Daryl Hammond, destroy people's lives?
To put into context, the psychiatric profession operates within. By the way, I got a letter last week from a professor at one of England's most prestigious university. There's one or two possibilities here, okay?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna name which one. This man has suffered symptoms, both physical and mental, for a long time. He himself has done enough reading to understand that all this is related to trauma. Both the physical symptoms and the mental distress that he goes through is related to trauma. Nobody in the psychiatric department at this world-famous British university was able to help him. Nobody. Out of several dozen psychiatrists, none of them could help him. None of them could make those connections and help him work it through. That's the state of the art. And I said, I'm not surprised. Then he found my work and he sent me this email. I said, I would have been surprised if any of them had been able to help you.
Sure.
Because the Western medical training of psychiatrists, but of physicians in general, completely separates the individuality from life experience. So that we're dealing with, they think they're dealing with isolated biological entities. And the way to fix things is to change the biology somehow through medical intervention, through pharmacology. Now, so that's not only true for the psychiatric profession, it's true in general for the medical profession. When it comes to psychiatry, though, when it's so clear, like Richard Bentall, who's a very well-known British psychologist, he said that the link between childhood adversity and adult mental health distress or illness is about as clear as the link between smoking and lung cancer. This is according to the printed, published, widely disseminated research literature. And the average psychiatrist is not even aware of that. Just as the average physician is not aware of the link between childhood distress, trauma, and autoimmune disease or malignancy for that matter. So the psychiatric profession works within a certain framework. That framework is the Western split mind from the body, split the individual from the environment, dualistic, reductionist medical ideology. And that itself functions within the context of a culture that separates the mind from the body and that tramples on essential human needs.
So let's go to the last chapter of the book, another really powerful chapter title. It's called Unmaking a Myth, Visioning a Saner Society. I do absolutely need to read out the first paragraph of this chapter. It's another favourite bit of mine. So you write,
Sure.
what will it take to unmake the myth of normal? How can we possibly hope to disassemble such a vast agglomeration of culturally manufactured misinterpretations, prejudices, blind spots, and health-killing fictions, especially when they serve the interests of a world order intent on its own continuance, even unto self-destruction? And Gabor, I love what you write in response to this question about not knowing the answer, and about optimism and disillusionment, and about waking up. And I wondered if you could just share some final thoughts about this question: what will it take to unmake the myth of normal?
Well, I think the first thing it'll take is to realize what a myth it is and not to buy into it anymore. It's not up to any one individual to prescribe what society should do, but if more people questioned, if people permitted themselves to be disillusioned, and I talk about this disillusionment, when people talk about being disillusioned, they think, oh no, it's a bad thing, a betrayal. No, what I ask people is, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned? Would you rather see reality the way it is, or would you rather have some concocted view of reality that hides truth from your eyes? And so disillusionment is a good thing. Losing illusions is a good thing. And so I think the biggest, or the essence of what I'm saying in this chapter is, people wake up, lose your illusions. Look at how it actually is. That's the beginning of wisdom, I think.
It's like taking the red pill, isn't it? You know, the Matrix analogy, taking the red pill. And it's also that thing of like, once you know, you can't unknow.
Yeah.
So, it's a powerful chapter. It's a powerful chapter. And you end with the words, it is our most daunting challenge and greatest possibility. And you're referring to, you know, that challenge of seeing the myth and.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't know what I mean when I'm thinking about how we put it right, but I think you're right about that. How can anything happen without first acknowledging it and seeing it?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully lots of us here are up for the challenge.
I'm very grateful for how carefully you seem to have read this book. I'm just thank you, because I mean you're the one of the first people I've talked to who've read the book. You know, so it's great to talk to somebody who actually gets it, reads it, and gets it.
Oh, total pleasure, absolutely, and very, very honoured to be, you know, kind of able to read it before most people. So that felt a bit special, and yeah, of course, you know, honoured to have this time with you today and to chat with you. I've really enjoyed it, and I just want to thank you for writing the book and for all you do to kind of help make the world a better place, really. I suppose all you do to make the culture less toxic and more normal.
Thank you. By the way, if I may mention for your British listeners, is that I will be in the UK in mid-October, including some public talk and for the How To Academy. So anybody's interested in seeing me live, I'll be there in London in sometime between the 10th and the 14th of October.
Oh, fantastic! That's great. I'm sure that'll be really popular. As it was, I think it was June that you were here, and that was. I heard a lot of great things about that. Listen, me and Lucy want to wish you all the best with the book, the best of luck. But as I say that, I'm really aware that you're not going to need it, and we're obviously going to be recommending it for sure. I hope that everybody reads it, even especially psychiatrists. And congratulations again on Publishing Week, and hope that you can take some time out for you and Ray and your family and Daniel, and enjoy the celebrations.
Thank you so much, Joe. Take care.
You take care too. Bye, Gabor.